history of Stonehenge and a book about the Battle of the Beanfield, and I'm going to just run through Stonehenge's mystical and pagan history today. So this year marks what may well be a significant centenary, the first appearance at Stonehenge on the summer solstice of a group of modern-day Druids, known as the Circle of the Universal Bond, or more commonly as the Ancient Druid Order, whose interest in Stonehenge and the solstice continues to this day. As with much of this early history, the dates are disputed. The Druid Order itself claims to have visited Stonehenge since at least 1810, but as it also claims to have been founded in 1245 and to have been allied with the Diggers and the Levellers after the English Civil War, it may be wise to approach these claims with a certain amount of scepticism. What's more likely is that the Druid Order was inspired to adopt Stonehenge after a visit by another Druid group, the Ancient Order of Druids, the previous August. Although these Druids had no explicit connection with paganism, being instead the continuation of a quasi-Masonic elite Christian brotherhood, invented by the carpenter and builder Henry Hurle in 1781, they made an impressive debut at Stonehenge, with 700 and more otherwise respectable members of the establishment, dressing in long white robes, wearing false beards and brandishing sickles. Noticeably, the Ancient Druid Order brought to Stonehenge a far more radical agenda than that provided by Henry Hurle's descendants, who functioned as a friendly society, devoted largely to charitable work and the mutual benefit of members. As well as drawing inspiration from the Ancient Order of Druids, the Ancient Druid Order also seems to have drawn on the writings of two influential individuals, the Druid-loving antiquarian William Stukeley, who discovered Stonehenge's summer solstice alignment in 1723, and the stonemason and scholar Edward Williams, more commonly known as Iolo McGanwy, who conjured up a Welsh Druidic history at the end of the 18th century. Williams' first Gorseth, held on Primrose Hill in London at the autumn equinox in 1792, and conducted within a small stone circle made of stones that he brought along in his pocket, was the first recognisable combination of three factors: a sacred place, a stone circle, and the quarters of the solar year, that are at the heart of the modern-day story of Stonehenge. The Druid Order also aspired to far more than Christianity and fancy dress. By the second half of the 19th century, they'd become, in the words of the historian Ronald Hutton, the most active and prominent practitioners of mystical Druidry in the country, immersed in the growth of occultism and spiritualism that was prevalent at the time, and influenced in particular by the teachings of Theosophy and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. As they began to exert their influence at Stonehenge, their palette of influences expanded. Their most prominent leader, George MacGregor Reid, who was the chief Druid from 1909 until his death in 1946, was a radical socialist, and he had travelled extensively in Afghanistan and India, where he had been initiated as a Buddhist. One of his most popular sayings was that God is too big and too great for any church. Under MacGregor Reid's leadership, the Druid Order harangued those in charge of Stonehenge on an annual basis. Initially, this took place through confrontation with its private owner, Sir Edmund Antrobus, who had raised a fence around Stonehenge and began to charge an entrance fee in 1901. Objecting to the fee, the Druids were often to be found cursing the owner and being physically ejected from the temple. In 1914, for example, according to the Salisbury Journal, MacGregor Reid and 9 companions, some of whom claimed descent from the ancient so-called fire worshippers of India, paid for admission while protesting against it. At 3:20 in the morning, MacGregor Reid began to recite the prayers of the sun worshippers at the altar. But he had not proceeded very far before Superintendent Buchanan of the Wiltshire Constabulary called his attention to a notice posted inside Stonehenge prohibiting the holding of any form of meeting or service within the circle, and requested him to desist. Dr. Reid disregarded the warning and continued the recital in a louder voice than before, whereupon Superintendent Buchanan informed him that he would have to leave. Dr. Reid declined to leave, and he was then forcibly ejected. He returned with his colleague George Catchlow at 11 in the morning and 6 p.m. when they conducted services outside. The following year there were further unsightly tussles, with the Druids refusing to pay and one of their number being forcibly removed from behind the altar stone. And when Sir Edmund Antrobus died soon after, relations between the Druids and the temple's owner had deteriorated to such an extent that the Druids took pride in claiming that his demise was the direct result of the curses of the previous summers. After the First World War, the Druids regularly aroused the wrath of the government, which had been given the monument for the benefit of the nation by its last private owner, Cecil Chubb, who had owned it briefly from 1915 to 1918. In 1919, when they sought access on the 21st and the 22nd of June, the custodian had to enlist the aid of 4 policemen to restrain them. The following year, they retaliated by demanding 4 days access on and around the solstice, prompting an exasperated official to declare, "Some limit must be set to this absurd and degrading nonsense." And in 1926, when they'd been banned from the solstice for trying to inter the ashes of one of their dead, an action which until then had been a fairly regular occurrence, they actually stormed the fences to get in. By the time the Second World War ended, however, the conflict between the Druids and the authorities had come to an end. The influential archaeologist O.G.S. Crawford described them as quite harmless and entitled to carry out their rites without molestation. Throughout the 1950s, they conducted solstice ceremonies every year, often accompanied by members of the general public, who began attending in ever larger numbers. However, the most important aspect of Druidry during this period was not the solstice ceremony at Stonehenge, but what was happening behind the scenes. 1946 was the first year that one particularly influential individual, Gerald Gardner, a retired colonial administrator with a lifelong interest in antiquarianism and the supernatural, was recorded as a member of the Druid order. It was a fruitful period for him. Over the next few years, he put together most of the background and materials required to launch a new religion, Wicca, in the 1950s. Presented as a surviving strand of an ancient tradition, in this case a surviving coven of witches in the New Forest, it's more likely that Wicca was instead the first manifestation of a modern form of paganism that was to prove enormously successful, and that was also to affect the future of Druidry. Although it differed from the Druids in its general disregard for ancient monuments, its focus on the moon, and its emphasis on working in private, it was clearly influenced by the proximity of its birth to Gardner's involvement in the Druid order, and in particular his friendship with another significant figure in the development of modern paganism, Ross Nichols, the Druid order's scribe. Nichols was a teacher, a historian, a poet, and a painter, and he helped Gardner to write the first book about Wicca, Witchcraft Today, which was published in 1954, just after the anti-witchcraft laws had been repealed in the UK. One of the more far-reaching results of his influence on Wicca, Druidry, and paganism in general was the creation of the eightfold year of festivals, combining the solstices and the equinoxes with the quarter days at the start of February, May, August, and November, the Celtic festivals known as Imbolc, Beltane, Lughnasadh, and Samhain. Nichols had first embraced the concept of the eightfold year in the 1940s through research into the folklore of the British Isles. At the time, the Druid order celebrated only two seasonal festivals, the summer solstice at Stonehenge and the autumn equinox at Primrose Hill. But in 1956, influenced by Nichols, Robert MacGregor Reid, who had taken over as chief druid after his father's death, was persuaded to hold a spring equinox ceremony near Tower Hill, which Nichols described as a traditional site of one of the places of free speech in Britain. Prevented by the authorities from using Tower Green, the order settled for a paved area near the Church of All Hallows by the Tower, and this immediately became a regular ceremony. Although Nichols' attempts to persuade the order to adopt the other five festivals, the winter solstice and the quarters of the Celtic year, were frustrated, and it was Gardner's Wiccans who took these up instead. Ross Nichols took the eightfold year with him when he split from the Druid order and set up a new order, the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, in 1964. He left because of a dispute over the leadership of the order following the death of Robert MacGregor Reid, although its genesis can be traced back to the latter years of George MacGregor Reid's tenure, when the elderly chief had discovered and adopted the Universalist Church, announcing that it and Druidry were in effect united, and he'd put forward a man called Smith as his successor in preference to his son. On MacGregor Reid's death, the order was divided. Some bowed to the late chief's wishes, while the majority prevailed on Robert to become their new chief. When Robert took over, he pursued a policy established by his father, establishing links with other organisations around the world. And with the help of Lewis Spence, a folklorist and incurable Celtic romantic, connections with Celtic organisations were encouraged. Representatives from 40 different countries, including Finland, Italy, Russia and Hungary, as well as the more obvious locations of Brittany, Cornwall and Wales, became involved in the gatherings at Stonehenge. Although, as Ross Nichols pointed out, it was necessary for the definition of Druidry to be fairly loosely applied. On Robert MacGregor Reid's death, after a narrow majority had voted for a homeopath called Thomas Morn as the new chief, a number of senior members voted against it and a second split occurred. Nichols wasted no time in establishing his new order, bringing to life his long-cherished dream of a seasonal round of ceremonies based on the eightfold year. And on a point of principle that should be heartening to all those concerned with open access to Stonehenge, his new offshoot promptly abandoned the summer solstice ceremonies at the Great Temple on Salisbury Plain, choosing to conduct their rituals at an Iron Age hill fort near Northampton. Nichols' exodus was precipitated by restrictions on the general public, based on complaints about hooliganism and general rowdiness that were imposed in 1964, when Stonehenge was fenced off with electrified wire and access was restricted to certain types of Druids only. In Nicholls' own words, after experience of this, the main order refused to function under circumstances whereby the people, unruly or not, were kept away from the publicly owned oldest national shrine on the day of the year designed for its cult. The answer should, of course, have been a few more police, not barbed wire. Subsequently, the order transferred its summer solstice ceremonies and its observations of the equinoxes to Parliament Hill in Highgate, where, as Nicholls put it, great cooperation was found, and where the people of England's capital could easily reach what may have been their old centre, one of the unfensible places like Hyde Park Corner, a place of free speech. The seasonal cycle of ceremonies was completed with a Beltane celebration on Glastonbury Tor and an observation of Lunacy in a private wood in the Chilterns, with the other festivals taking place at Nicholls' house in West London. The remaining members of the ancient Druid order continued to celebrate the summer solstice at Stonehenge throughout the 60s and into the 70s, although in failing to hold to Obod's principles, the rump of those who had fought for access in the first half of the century began to look more and more like an opportunistic elite. And I have it on good authority that in 1970, when Thomas More was concerned that the order had so few members that the authorities might wish to revoke their right to gather, he recruited a number of members of Mensa to add to the Druids and gave them all white sheets for the occasion. Moreover, as Stonehenge began to be embraced by a new breed of countercultural pioneers, the Druid order found its authority usurped by the vision of a young man called Phil Russell, an eccentric, privately funded orphan, who was also known as Wally Ho. In 1974, Russell organised a free festival at Stonehenge on the summer solstice, which established the temple as a multifaceted countercultural icon. After his mysterious death in 1975, the festival assumed a new and potent spiritual angle, when a number of his friends and companions invaded the stones on the day of the solstice to scatter his ashes, establishing a rite of pilgrimage that was begrudgingly respected by the authorities until 1984. As the festival grew in size and influence, the solstice ceremony at its heart, with its hand fastings, baby blessings and arcane rituals, provided the basis for an evolving mixture of anarchy and mysticism that was to play a vital role in the development of modern paganism. Those contributing to this powerful mixture of politics and spirituality included Bev Richardson, who now lives in Ireland, who as a teenager had had a life-changing encounter with the elderly Gerald Gardner, and who was central to the festival's connection with the Stones as a pagan free spirit and a prominent traveller. The late John Pendragon, another spiritual leader remembered with widespread affection. Rick Mays, better known as Rick the Vic, whose forays into interfaith dialogue prefigured the developments of the following decades, and Sid Rawle, who had founded the Hyde Park Diggers in 1960s London, based on the example provided by Gerard Winstanley's Diggers in the years following the English Civil War. Sid was a prominent figure in the free festival scene. He helped organise the Windsor Free Festival, which ran for 3 August bank holiday weekends.
Sid did nights, and Steve Irwin did it all.
Okay.
Sid did fuck all except take credit for it.
Okay. For the next 8 years, the Stonehenge Festival duly fulfilled the wildest extremes of its countercultural mandate, becoming the central event of a growing travellers movement that established a roster of free festivals throughout the country from May to September, and also becoming in due course a magnet for a bewildering kaleidoscope of anti-Thatcherite dissent. While the festival goers were blending their own mixture of paganism and radical politics at Stonehenge, Michael Dames, a lecturer in the history of art, was building on the foundations provided by John Michel, combining worship of the great goddess with the festivals of the eightfold year, to create a vision of Stonehenge's neighbour Avebury, in the Silbury Treasure published in 1976, that was to make Avebury into another powerful sacred landscape for the new paganism, and that ultimately had a knock-on effect on Stonehenge as well. Unaware that the theory of a universal goddess, which had been embraced by archaeologists in the 1950s, had been discredited, Michael Dames discovered the theory in the works of Jacquetta Hawkes, Stuart Piggott and O.G.S. Crawford, looked at Silbury Hill in Avebury with an artist's eye, and found that from above it made the figure of a great goddess. The following year in the Avebury cycle, he drew connections between a number of Avebury's most prominent monuments, the West Kennet Long Barrow, the Sanctuary, the Great Henge and the Stone Circles, and Silbury Hill, bringing them all together in an annual round of celebration based on the quarter days. For those who are unaware of the discrepancies in Dames' methodology, and there were many, not least the assumption that long barrows and henges, for example, were in use during the same period, his vision was compelling. As Ronald Hutton pointed out, they were ceremonies which people could perform, and so within a year people were there, That's why women were dancing on Silbury Hill at the August full moon. The converts referred to by Hutton were spiritual feminists, inspired by the growth of feminism, paganism and the peace movement, which was focused in Britain on the proposed cruise missile base at Greenham Common in Berkshire. Throughout the early 80s they were drawn to Avebury in increasing numbers, and at Beltane in 1985 200 women, mostly connected with Greenham, gathered on Silbury Hill for a 3-day pilgrimage to Stonehenge. Linda Lee, who wrote an article about the walk for Festival Eye, declared optimistically that it was a revival of a long-standing tradition performed hundreds and possibly thousands of years ago by women to link up the energies between Avebury and Stonehenge. In many ways, the Beltane Walk was the pagan peace movement personified. The women chanted, sang and danced on the summit of Silbury and asked the goddess to bless us with cosmic energy and through us to join it with the energy of the earth so that we might become cauldrons in an alchemical marriage. On the first day, the women walked across the Vale of Pewsey, camping on the edge of the Ministry of Defence land on Salisbury Plain, where they ran up against a wall of police on the following morning. Clearly disorientated by a mass of women singing, "We are the flow and we are the earth, we are the weavers and we are the web, we are the flow and we are the earth, we are the witches back from the dead," the police escorted the women across the plain to within 4 miles of Stonehenge, where they finally decided to stop them for good. 3 times, however, the women slipped through the police lines, reaching the monument unmolested, and on the final day they went into Stonehenge and performed an anarchic ritual, with many of them staying overnight, sleeping in the stone circle under the light of the full moon, while the authorities made no attempt to stop them.
Yes, because her dad was here, and they were the CIA. Police is dead then.
Thanks, Woody. Significantly, one of the women on 1985's Beltane Walk, the woman focalising our rituals, as Linda Lee described it, was Starhawk, a Californian witch who was at the forefront of the peace movement against the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and who reversed the prevailing trend towards separatist feminism in American witchcraft, reintegrating men without compromising her position as a spiritual leader of women. A month after the Beltane Walk, the Stonehenge Free Festival came to an abrupt and bloody end at the notorious Battle of the Beanfield. The authorities responsible for the temple and its immediate surroundings, the National Trust, the newly created Quango English Heritage, the police and several prominent landowners, conspired to raise a precautionary injunction against 83 named people who, it was claimed, made up the central element of those likely to attend the festival. And on June the 1st, 1985, after 140 vehicles had set off from an overnight camp in Savernake Forest near Marlborough, in the hope of establishing the 12th Free Festival at Stonehenge, they were ambushed, assaulted and arrested with extreme brutality by over 1,300 police officers drawn from 6 counties in the Ministry of Defence, and the Stonehenge Festival came to an abrupt end. While the licensed persecution of the Travellers movement was the most significant result of the Battle of the Beanfield, the clampdown on the festival also had a knock-on effect on the Druid ceremonies, leading to the first ban on the Druid Order's solstice gatherings for over 50 years. On the morning of the solstice, the great Sarsens of Stonehenge were guarded, imprisoned and alone. The Druid Order performed a midnight ceremony on Normanton Down before heading down to Maiden Castle in Dorset for the solstice dawn, while Pagans for Peace, a group of 50 people who had walked to Stonehenge from London, were the only observers of the dawn at Stonehenge, strung out along the perimeter fence like refugees catching a glimpse of forbidden freedom. As if the events of 1985 were not alarming enough, the persecution continued the following year, when a convoy of travellers was shunted around southern England for weeks on end, before having the majority of their vehicles impounded and destroyed at Stony Cross in Hampshire. Only a few hundred people, this time including the ancient Druid Order, made it through to Stonehenge for the solstice, where they held a defiant ceremony on the roadside. The events of 1986 marked the Druid Order's penultimate gesture of solidarity with the travellers and festival goers. The last took place in 1988 when David Loxley, the chief of the Druid Order, attended a meeting of the Stonehenge Campaign, which is a coalition of festival goers dedicated to the reinstatement of the festival and of religious access to the stones. And at this meeting, Loxley said that the Order was in favour of the festival goers' presence and that attempts would be made to sort out a ritual for both groups to take part in together. For solstice in 1987, English Heritage offered 500 free tickets for dawn at the stones in advance, and the Druid Order accepted. The Stonehenge Campaign and others who were pressing for free and open access refused, but what could have been a night of confrontation was resolved with a display of tolerance at 6:30 in the morning. After the Druids had performed their rituals, about 300 people were allowed in, where they joined hands in a circle around the henge and spiralled into the stones, chanting, "The earth is our mother, we should take good care of her." Satisfied with this arrangement, English Heritage expanded the free ticket scheme the following year, in 1988, this time offering 1,000 tickets in advance. Once more the Druid Order accepted, along with locals, archaeologists and other interested parties, and once more those who were pressing for free access for all refused. Although 4,000 people had gathered during the week before the solstice in Cholderton Woods, to the east of Stonehenge, on the night they found themselves once more set upon by riot police, while the Druid Order and others who had accepted tickets for the most part turned a blind eye. Significantly, however, the ancient Druid Order was not the only group of Druids campaigning for access in the years after the beanfield. 5 groups in particular were established at the time, one derived from the historical Druids, one from Wicca, and the other 3 from the years of the Free Festival. The Order of Bards, Owates and Druids, which had ground to a halt when Ross Nichols died in 1975, was revived in 1988 by Philip Cargon, a psychotherapist. From Wicca came the British Druid Order, founded by the musician and poet Philip Shellcrass, with the aim of establishing a native British spirituality. And from the festival years came the Secular Order of Druids, founded by Tim Sebastian, a devotee of John Michel, the Glastonbury Order, founded by Rollo Morfling, who had been involved in an offshoot of Wicca, and the Loyal Arthurian Warband, led by Arthur Pendragon, a former soldier and biker leader, described by Ronald Hutton as a sincere natural mystic, whose very strong libertarian political convictions are bound up with a sense of guidance by supernatural forces. While the revived Order of Bards, Owates and Druids, OBOD, and the British Druid Order showed some initial reluctance to become involved in the campaign for access to Stonehenge, the other 3 orders were engaged with the struggle from their earliest days. Indeed, I could go so far as to say that the suppression of the festival and the need to explore new and creative ways of engaging with the authorities over Stonehenge were central to the genesis of all of these groups. Tim Sebastian, for example, had set up the Secular Order in 1975 to provide a bridge between the festival goers and the Druids, but it wasn't until 1986 that the order came to prominence, joining the ranks of the excluded on the road outside Stonehenge. And that year they lightly tripped into place with their minstrels and floral costumes. They invited the crowd to sing along with David Bowie's Memory of a Free Festival and announced that the battle for Stonehenge is over. Let the battle for the soul of the nation begin, which was somewhat premature in light of later events. The following year the Secular Order went in as part of the crowd of 300 who spiralled into the stones after the Druid Order had finished its rituals. And as the events of 1988 and 1989 unfolded, they duly ran up against truncheons and arrest. The Glastonbury Order, founded on Glastonbury Tor at Beltane in 1988 with similar aims to the Secular Order, to offer a new age alternative to the way Druidism had been presented up till then, was led by Rollo Morfling, a free festival with pagan credentials. As a child growing up in Cornwall, he recalled being carried on his father's shoulders to a gorset of Cornish bards in the Boscawen stone circle. He met John Michel, who he described as the literary interpreter of the visionary kingdom, when he was young, and later became a pupil of Alex Sanders, the founder of Alexandrian Wicca. Almost as soon as they declared their existence, the Glastonbury Druids secured access to Stonehenge for the summer solstice in 1988. But it was not a happy occasion. Remembering the violence that took place outside the perimeter fence that year, Rollo declared that the dreadful events of that day still ring in our minds, and we have vivid memories of seeing so many friends being brutalised as scapegoats for the authorities' mismanagement of the whole affair. His conclusion about the Druid Order was even harsher. Though it's not our purpose to criticise any other Druid Order, it was brought to our attention that the then presiding order had not only lost touch with the people, but with the whole situation at Stonehenge. Arthur's involvement with Stonehenge also dated from the years of the Free Festivals, when as biker leader John the Hat he had first experienced the allure of the stones. As he and C.J. Stone described in their book The Trials of Arthur, there was something about sitting around a campfire at night weaving tales, with the silhouette of the stones nearby, that called upon the spirits of the ancestors to join them at the party, to commune with them. In 1986, shortly after he'd first been led to consider that his calling might be to present himself to the world as the Arthur Pendragon of the Thatcher years, and while he was still wondering if he was actually possessed by a vision or a delusion, he drove down to Stonehenge to seek a sign. After climbing over the perimeter fence and avoiding the attention of the security guards, he made it to the centre of the stones, where a raven brushed his face with its wing. Arthur and C.J. described it as an act of consecration, as if something from nature had priest-like laid a hand upon his forehead to offer blessings for his chosen cause. His mission to free Stonehenge began in the winter of 1990 when he embarked on a one-man sit-in outside the temple to protest at the charging of an entrance fee. For 4 months he lived in a bunker between 2 trees, relying for food and drink on the generosity of strangers. And at the solstice he embarked on the first of a series of voluntary arrests for breaking through the exclusion zone that ran on down the years as persistently and pig-headedly as the authorities' intransigence endured. That first year he was arrested for possession of an offensive weapon, his sword Excalibur, at a party inside the exclusion zone. In 1992 he caused confusion in the police ranks by declaring that he and his companions were not in fact forming a procession of 2 or more people, which was illegal, but were only attempting to have a picnic. And in 1993 he got through to the Stones. As the troubled 1980s yielded to a questionable new decade, a surreal scenario ensued. These 5 new Druid orders, together with the original Druid revivalists, Henry Hale's Ancient Order of Druids, came together in a short-lived confederation, the Council of British Druid Orders, which sought to agree on ways of dealing with their exclusion from Stonehenge at the summer solstice, as well as more generally finding common ground. The Council's most notable success was the establishment at Avebury of the Gorseth of Bards of Care Abbey, which developed from a multi-faith conference convened by Tim Sebastian of the Secular Order at the autumn equinox in 1993. Based in the stone circles, the Gorseth centred on a ceremony composed and conducted by Philip Shallcrass of the British Druid Order, using parts of Edward Williams's Primrose Hill ceremony from 1792. And it soon became a regular occurrence, taking place on the festival days of the eightfold year, with representatives from many different spiritual traditions. The gatherings grew at an astonishing rate, and within 5 years they were regularly attracting 1,000 participants. But despite this success, the Council's united front was short-lived. The visions of Druidry held by the various groups were so different, ranging from the social interests and mutual support of the ancient order through to the political activism of the Arthurian warband, that it was unlikely that any consensus would last for long, and within a few years the coalition broke up. The Ancient Order of Druids abandoned Stonehenge completely, and the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids and the British Druid Order began negotiations for their own special access on the days around the solstice, while maintaining a secondary commitment to open access for everybody else. Noticeably, the Ancient Druid Order, the only group that hadn't really been involved in the Council, regained their traditional access for the solstice dawn in 1990, and held on to that privilege exclusively until 1995, when they finally accepted a compromise on special access dates with the other Druid Orders, well, with Obod and the British Druid Order rather, and shifted their rituals to one of the following days. In the meantime, Arthur's commitment to free access for all was unwavering. In 1994, accompanied by a documentary crew from Radio 4, he made it to the Stones again, correctly predicting that the police would be reluctant to run through the whole embarrassing charade in the presence of the media. And the next few years saw an extraordinary increase in his activities, both against the exclusion zone at Stonehenge and as part of the road protest movement, an offshoot of the free festival scene and the Greenham Common protests, which began in 1992 at Twyford Down near Winchester, where 2 young travellers, appalled at the prospect of an extension to the M3 being hacked through the downland, set up a protest camp that rapidly turned into a nationwide phenomenon, and which in addition demonstrated a raw, untutored paganism that went further than any previous protest movement in embracing the concept of the whole of the earth as a sacred landscape. Arthur had first become involved in the road protest movement at Beltane in 1993, when the Dongers, which was the name of the group on Twyford Down, taken from an African name for the ancient tracks that crossed the landscape, had invited him to conduct a ceremony at the camp. In 1996 he embraced the struggle on a full-time basis, joining the largest action to date, the campaign against the A34 Newbury bypass. And on the summer solstice he led the most concerted assault on the exclusion zone at Stonehenge, a multi-pronged barrage of intruders approaching from all directions. By the end of the night, 27 people, including 13 Druids, had been arrested. At Avebury, meanwhile, the lingering conflict between the different Druids didn't come to a head until Beltane in 1997. And even then it was not precipitated by conflict between individual Druids, but by pressure from the public. As Ronald Hutton described it, the congregation shouted down the political Druids when they began giving speeches on the progress of campaigns about Stonehenge and road building schemes. The vast majority of people visiting Avebury wanted to have a spiritual experience. They wanted the processions, the ceremonies of naming and blessing, the music. They didn't want orators shouting at them. A fraught atmosphere prevailed over the rest of the weekend. Tempers flared and the spectre of a Stonehenge-like exclusion zone at Avebury was raised when the National Trust manager became involved in the conflict. adding to the tension by making a speech in which he expressed his concern about 5 young people he'd discovered lighting a fire on Silbury Hill the night before, watched over by a certain Druid chief. Unfortunately, he said the wrong things to the wrong people, went on for too long, and gave an impression of blaming all the Druids. And it was only through furious backtracking on his part and the intervention of Philip Shallcrass and Ronald Hutton that a Battle of Avebury was avoided, and separate days were agreed for future gatherings. Arthur and the political Druids would come to Avebury and hold their ceremonies on the nearest Saturday to the festival days, and Philip Shallcrass and his company would choose the Sundays. At Stonehenge, meanwhile, despite the concessions for the more malleable Druids, it wasn't until 1998 that English Heritage finally came up with anything other than the exclusion zone. It has spread a desolate silence over Stonehenge on the summer solstice for over a decade. They were prompted by access arrangements introduced at the spring equinox, when over 200 people were allowed in, all of whom left peacefully at the conclusion of the celebrations. Even so, the proposals put forward for the solstice were exactly the same as those that had last been attempted 10 years before. 500 free tickets for dates on and around the solstice were offered in advance to a wide range of interested parties. But although around 250 people took up the offer, those who were committed to open access for all had no option but to turn it down yet again. At the solstice, the gulf between those with and without tickets was as pronounced as it had ever been. Arthur maintained his customary campaign for free access, getting himself arrested, which was odd, as C.J. Stone noted, because he actually had a ticket to get in, but that's Arthur for you. In the meantime, around 100 people, including representatives of 6 different Druid groups, other pagans, locals, archaeologists, and 40 press reporters and photographers, all took advantage of the special access arrangements, although according to the majority of reports it wasn't a very satisfactory occasion. Emma Restelaw of the British Druid Order noted that with as many press as there were of Druids, pagans and others, the whole event was very difficult. The last stage in this long-running farce took place in 1999, shortly after an appeal court to the House of Lords, which included Lord Hutton and the Lord Chancellor Derry Irving, finally ruled that the exclusion zone around Stonehenge was actually illegal. Ignoring the threat posed by several thousand people being allowed to congregate outside the perimeter fence, instead of facing the handcuffing and arrest scenario that's been prevalent since 1989, English Heritage offered 1,000 free tickets over the solstice period, and those committed to open access were again obliged to refuse. On solstice night, several thousand people duly turned up, and about 2 in the morning, a few hundred people broke down the perimeter fence and proceeded to occupy the stones. The night ended in clashes with the police and 23 arrests, and there was much lamenting from various commentators who tried to blame the occupation on class war activists. In reality, given that the exclusion zone had been lifted but the access restrictions on congregating at the stones had not, it was more likely that the invasion was simply a spontaneous demonstration of frustration by those with a long history of exclusion. In light of this rather shambolic performance by English Heritage...
You're not mentioned in your book, Stonehenge hippies, for example. Your book is all about the Druid point of view, the right-wing point of view.
No, it's not, Willie.
No, it isn't.
No, it
isn't. You
isn't.
mentioned the convoy.
Yeah, there's loads about the convoy.
You mentioned all the other alternative things. You've only mentioned the right-wing Druids, isn't it, so far?
This is a talk about Druids today, though, Willie.
Well, it's talking about the things about Stonehenge.
Yeah, but it's...
Stonehenge subversion and the pagan intervention, as it says in the thing, not the
it is.
So far, it's all
it is what it says. It is what it says in there, Willie. But this is actually. It's a talk about. It's a talk about the pagan and mystical history of Stonehenge. I did a talk about festivals over at the Green Forum before, so I'm sorry if that title's misled you. But I mean, today I'm talking about the pagans of Stonehenge. Well, no, I didn't. I mean, it's just that that was the title that was printed for this, and it isn't really accurate because that title doesn't even make sense. Where was I? 1999. In light of this rather shambolic performance by English Heritage and the police, few could have suspected how swiftly and decisively both parties would respond to the full ramifications of the House of Lords' decision. But in the months that followed the solstice in '99, both English Heritage and the police reached the inevitable conclusion that the prohibition on access at the solstice was now unworkable. After 16 years, a mixture of compromise, conciliation and common sense prevailed. And on the morning of 21st June 2000, over 6,000 people duly turned up to take advantage of the new détente, crowding into the stones to celebrate the crucial dawn, even though it rained all night and the sunrise was invisible. From around the globe, the world's media were out in force, and the following morning, good news was for once allowed to dominate the newspapers' front pages. Modern pagans reclaim Stonehenge, said the Times. and the independent led with thousands see the dawn of a peaceful party at Stonehenge. Most of all, though, it was a night of celebration for those who'd experienced the solstice at the Stones in the years before the beanfield, and those who'd been unable to do so in the years since. Arthur Pendragon entered the circle at dawn, shouting above the noise of the crowd, "This is your henge, this is your temple, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You've as much right to be here as anyone else." And if his words were a vindication of the efforts of all those who'd struggled for years to liberate the solstice celebration at the Stones, it was left to festival veteran Margaret Greenfields to capture a more emotional side to the event. Margaret wrote, "I was surprised as I stumbled across these ruts in the field, clutching the hand of my 10-year-old daughter, that I had tears rolling down my face. We were back, and I tell you, I wasn't the only person I saw that night in tears. There were a lot of old faces. Often we just nodded at each other with no need for words. It was one of the most emotional times of my life." Since the triumph of the celebrations in 2000, the number of people attending the summer solstice at Stonehenge has continued to grow. From my own experience, the gatherings have generally been relaxed and good-natured, a heady mixture of a stoned libertarian tribal gathering and a spiritual free-for-all. But not everyone's happy with the developments. In 2002, the Mayor of Amesbury, who attended the solstice celebrations that year, highlighted what he saw as widespread alcohol and drug abuse, suggested that there were too many people and concluded that it was a desperately frightening situation, and it reminded me of the problems of the 1980s. The following year, more moderate misgivings were spelt out by Scott Green, the property manager for Stonehenge for the National Trust, who said the Trust is not convinced that the solstice observance as it is currently celebrated is sustainable in the long term. And members of various Druid orders have also expressed concerns. Emma Restelaw of the British Druid Order, who outlined her concerns after attending the reopening of the solstice in 2000, after conceding that it was a wet, wild and happy party, with for the most part an exhilarating atmosphere, and that she didn't mind in the slightest that there was no space, quiet or respect for the rituals that we might have wished to do, asked a single question: whether Stonehenge was on the 21st of June open for the people of Britain and the world beyond. After discounting Druid claims for exclusive access, as she said, "because I believe that it's a place that everyone should be free to go," and refuting English Heritage's exclusive rights to close the place completely, she concluded nevertheless that the group who claimed the temple were just another minority subculture. Although she was undoubtedly voicing concerns and criticisms that were held by other groups of Druids and Pagans, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that her denigration of the open communal solstice was somewhat hypocritical. For at least 6 years before Stonehenge was reopened in 2000, both OBOD and the British Druid Order had negotiated their own private access on days around the solstice, while maintaining a secondary commitment to access for all. And these gatherings are exactly the sort of small, disciplined and reverent gatherings that they wish to see at Stonehenge. So it seems to me that their existence should be accepted as part of the trade-off for the larger gatherings on the solstice itself. Judging the majority of a crowd of 6,000 people as a minority subculture does little to foster the impression that managed open access was really what the British Druid Order had in mind, when, as Emma Restelaw put it, describing her involvement in the Access Committee, it was decided that we should try and remove all of the fences around Stonehenge. From my own perspective, I think there are certain other problems relating to the current access arrangements, which both could and should be addressed. At its best, it seems to me that solstice access demonstrates that with only the stones, the dawn and other people, it's possible to hold a gathering in a context that doesn't involve either making money or spending it, which is increasingly rare. It's also true, however, that many of those attending, and over half of them are presumed to be young local people, coming along for what's effectively a free party, are not very well equipped to deal with the lack of focus during the long hours before the dawn. So I'd suggest that a number of solutions are apparent. Firstly, the authorities could swallow their fear of the festival and start a meaningful dialogue about an alternative gathering for those like the Stonehenge campaign who seek a revival of the free festival. And they could consider actively encouraging a number of musicians to perform, providing a much-needed focus throughout the hours of darkness, and removing the suspicion that they're somehow conspiring to create as chaotic an event as possible. And thirdly, I think they could open up free access to Stonehenge on a more regular basis, say one Sunday in every month, to divert those who may not be particularly interested in the solstice itself, but who find the prospect of being able to walk among the stones, as opposed to walking around them at a distance of 100 feet, such a thrill. I also think the Pagans should consider becoming more involved in performing ceremonies to entertain and edify the gatherings at Stonehenge. I understand that many Druids and other Pagans would prefer a more sedate gathering. This is already an option that many groups exercise on the days before and after the solstice. It may be impossible to occupy the centre of the stones, and it seems unreasonable to me to expect the Druids should have some sort of privileged access. But this doesn't rule out the possibility of conducting ceremonies that, for example, circle around the stones, or that make the most of the land between the circle and the heel stone on the line of the sunrise. While I know this isn't the easiest of propositions to facilitate, and that Stonehenge's history of confrontation and conflict makes it a less appealing venue than Avebury for many modern-day pagans, the fact is that Stonehenge remains an extraordinarily potent symbol, whose resonance should not extend solely to its curators and to crowds of partygoers. As John Michel wrote after the Battle of the Beanfield, those who knew not of Stonehenge, who had never experienced its weird and lasting attraction, were astounded. What is this old pile of rocks which inspires such intensity of personal religious feeling and such vicious expressions of official jealousy? Those who come to Stonehenge to party have often ended up returning with a more inquiring mind. When they do so, they may appreciate some advice from those who have already experienced its weird and lasting attraction. That's your lot. Thank you very much.